Recording. All right, welcome everyone at the Multi-Network Community Sync. Today is August 2nd, and today I think we first gonna talk about the Kubelet CRI API. Right, Michael, can you kind of kick this off on what you have? And then I think I had some ideas on, maybe you start on what you have. Can you do that? Is that okay?
Definitely. So I typed up a very draft document yesterday about breaking down some of this work into various tracks to help support multi-network in a very iterative fashion. And last week we talked about, if we have multiple networks, on a pod, that we need a method to return IP addresses. Thus, that pointed to the pod sandbox status CRI message type, which doesn't really include what we need. So in the case that we actually need interface name, the network name, and IP addresses. And I made a very simplistic proposal, what we have as the current, and then I have a proposal that obviously can be changed. This was about 5 minutes of thought to provide some incremental progress here. And effectively, I took a multis approach, which obviously the annotations could be multis here. And how do we add value to the pod? And that was effectively expanding the pod sandbox status message to include some additional information with a future track that would also make the pod aware, which involves kubelet changes. On a second vein, we have track B, which is the multi-network KEP, which effectively most likely be modifying the run pod sandbox request to add some, potential fields that will invalidate or negate the need for annotations. And that seemed like those two tracks could move in parallel, and that we could actually cover more ground, and they need to happen regardless. So they could be broken out in two separate KEPs. We meet in the middle, and we potentially cut our time down, hopefully. So the one item here that really needs to happen is that we need to agree on the most simplistic change to the CRI that will give us the most value. And that's where I just came up with those three fields in my proposal: the name, interface name, and like pod IPs could add significant value. And then the track B, or current one, would obviously make a proposal for the run pod sandbox request that with the goal to get rid of the annotations and be able to link eventually our pod network resource Kubernetes object all together.
So this picture is the kind of current state of, right, Michael?
That is the current, yes.
And basically, those are CRI calls, or those are like
yes.
calls from?
Those are all the CRI calls that go into the container runtime. In this one, it's containerd, but CRI follows a very similar approach. They may have different, status may be different. I think it follows a similar route though. So the areas that we're looking at is run pod sandbox and run pod sandbox status, which will give us our IP addresses, and then something on the run pod sandbox would need to change to support a more thorough approach. The one thing to keep in mind with run pod sandbox is that we don't take the entire pod spec and shove it into the run pod sandbox gRPC function call or the request. So we need to keep that in mind.
I just realized, but those functions, the APIs are defined in the containerd, right, or not?
Both sides.
What do you mean POP? Oh, because it's a common. Okay, so basically, in kubelet, I have the kind of signature of those methods only, but then implementation is done on the. Is this what? That's another thing. So, are there like two separate paths in kubelet, whether it's a containerd or CRI or anything else, or do they all share the APIs?
They all share the CRI API. So in
Mhm.
this case, say like SyncPod is actually passing the run pod sandbox request. The container runtime in this case is coming back with run pod sandbox response, which only returns the UID of the pod, which that was my action item to put the requests and responses in
Mhm.
this to make it a little bit easier to consume. And I haven't gotten to that, unfortunately. It's just a little too busy.
Right. What do I want to know? Okay, so I wonder what, because those are signatures, but then I wonder. I assume we can only propose on what we would want to send to and how we would want to change those signatures. But then it has to be CRI that will eventually implement those, right?
It'll be,
And
yeah, I mean, the container runtime will need to know how to handle the request and send the response. As
right,
of Kubernetes will need to know how to send the request and receive the response.
right. But then when we do sync pod is okay, pod sandbox status. This is because this is where you want to change this on the bottom, right? With the messages, with expanding of the message with this, right? So
Yes.
basically that will then give us ability, and then SyncPod would have to understand. And are you trying to then as well include in your cap the ability to update the API, the one that we would add? Because that's where the gap would be right now, right? I think this is
Yeah.
something that we still don't have. So
We
would that
would,
be the part of it?
yeah, that would the scope would be to update the CRI API to include the necessary fields. And
Hmm.
then we would probably, I'm not certain if it requires a second cap to go into the kubelet and say, hey, instead of just handling one IP,
Hmm.
one address family per, oh, Jesus, whatever it is,
Right.
we will implement that under a feature gate. So then,
Right.
it's either enabled or it's not. And it goes into the staging CRI API code until it's fully promoted out.
Right. And then yeah, we either populate does the pod status with a single IP or multiple with the names.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so that's and so that's a good plan if we have that. But then from our side, I wonder what I'm getting at is we can probably just change the sync pod to include the whatever we want to do to be passed into run pod sandbox, right? But then it will be up to the CRIs to adapt that new parameters that are passed, right?
Yes, that'll be up. In this case, yes, it could be the container runtimes, and
Right.
I'll even implement that just for
Yeah.
funsies. So, but yeah,
Sure.
someone has to know about it on that side. So that will cover these are pod setup, pod network setup, and our
Hmm.
pod teardown.
Right.
So we've satisfied kind of the scope because we said that updates and more are, future state.
Right.
And don't worry about that yet.
Yeah. All right. Anything else, Michael, to this? Do we want to say?
That was effectively it. So, and the nice piece of this is it's highly iterative and small changes, so we can, measure our success for each change here by adding a little bit, some tactical gains. And it doesn't paint us into a corner either. And these small changes may identify like, hey, this approach isn't going to work any longer. We need to look at our future work, like, number 4 for some reason highlight it right now. I have no idea. But like or approve the shape, the API, or it's a new API altogether. So this isn't saying that this must be the way, but it's iterative enough that it's not a lot of investment the hardest investment is just writing the cap and, sitting down
Right.
and doing the, all of that. So that's just my like proposal. And if we agreed upon the small little, what a pod network resource looks in a CRI API, this all moves forward and we can get that going. And the first cap will be the hardest cap here. And then all the future caps just draft off the others to completion.
All right. So I think I find this awesome plan. Yeah, that's, I think from our side would be to just try and define what we want to pass here in this to this run pod sandbox. But in a second, any other comments on this? Yep. All right. So I think what we can do next is now discuss on what we would consider passing to that sync pod when we create a pod, right? So what sort of information, and let's just kind of list them only, and then I will try to look at the sync pod and run pod where exactly we can propose a change in such a way that we are not breaking anyone, right? So, but let's maybe discuss. I will get back to the cap of ours. Share this up instead. And considering what we are thinking of the, let me just zoom this in a bit. What we are thinking of, like what pod network has, right? What parameters we have, some IPAM information, and then the provider and the name of the pod network itself, right? What can we pass into the that API call to the CRI. Right now, from pod network attachment, what we have is interface name and one of the two. I would imagine that the first thing definitely we want to pass is the network name, right? And that will be in a ways where I just straightforward pass the name of this guy, or if I have a pod network interface in place, I just grab. I would have to grab the object and then get the pod name from that guy. And if you want to gonna remind what's a pod network interface, it has a field called pod name. So basically, I only pass the name of the network that I want to connect. That would be one of the kind of arguments for the struct. Let me maybe just draw this out a bit. So what you had, Michael, a network CRI, yes, here. So basically, let me just borrow from the name of the function.
And real fast, one thing that we can keep in mind is that Multus does this really successfully, so we can probably use that as a guide. You already called out several fields that they already use, like pod network and more.
Right. So new fields. So basically, this would have to get again networks list as a list network list, and then that will be of some struct type struct network, and basically now our struct network, what will that look like, right? And bear with me, just some pseudocode, doesn't matter, but we know it will have to have a pod network in it. That will be just a string. What else we think because right now, if I'm not mistaken, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, I assume today we don't pass anything in terms of like what network I want to configure, right?
Nope.
We just
Nothing.
create me a namespace, use the default CNI and be done with it, right?
Yep.
So exactly. So today we would add this additional field called networks or something like that, and then the CRI just either uses that and or passes it down the pipe. But then I was thinking on this, how we would differentiate the basic use case, right? Let's say I want to just use the basic use case where my pod network is just a name for the CNI config, right? Or the CNI conf name, whatever this, whichever it has to match to, right? from all the CNIs that I have configured in my CNI path, right? So, or maybe some other means, right? However, some of the CRIs would implement it. So basically what I was thinking is we would have to pass as well a provider, because that way we can identify, okay, who's handling this pod network from the CRI point of view, right? Is it Multus? And basically maybe for Multus, they just want the way it is today, where just call me and I'm Meta plugin and I'm handling the whole thing by myself. So don't cut in. Or is it just fully containerd, for example, where they would grab the name and find a matching CNI? And this is all up to how they want to implement this. So to achieve that kind of distinction, we would need to provide pass the provider, because then we would easily can say that in a provider in the network, let me step back here, pod network here, in a provider, where do I have some example? Yes, here. I can provide, like, it's either the Multus is using this or it's the containerd. Because otherwise, if we won't specify that, CRI would not know how to differentiate between this use case that they want to implement versus, oh, don't do anything, just do whatever and just pass all the list to the CNI, right? So one of the two would have to be implemented. And basically, this is, Michael, where your implementation goes into play as well, to ensure that CRIs can support such case, right? So basically, when you're gonna do the track A cap, this is where we would have to ensure that they want to support that don't do anything approach as well. You see that?
Yeah, and so just to break it down, we have, like, the use case here is that, I'm 80% of Kubernetes. I don't care about, I wanted to do the default route. In that case, like, this field that we're proposing to change probably should just be nil and empty. It should just do the default behavior. And then you don't care. And we're trying to tackle multiple networks here, where in that case, that field should be populated. And we're proposing that something on the other side goes down and does something different. Now, Multus is actually a CNI itself.
True.
So that's where I'm confused.
So let me tell you. So basically, what I'm referring to here is whether this name, because what we can, how the CRI can take this, right? So it can, if it's a some provider that I don't care, it's a list of networks that I pass to the CRI, which should be then passed into the CNI. All right. So basically, CNI gets that whole list that we are currently thinking of what it's going to be in it, right? So basically, the CNI gets all that list, right? And right now it's going to be just a name of the pod network and at least provider, right? So basically, straightforward from the provider, Multus will see, do I worry about this network or not, right? Do I provide it? And of course, it's based on how the implementation is done, right? Because that's as well kind of important on that. And then based on pod network, Multus can, okay, I need to grab this pod network from API and do, because I need all the extra parameter reference to do my OWL bidding, right? So it will do that, and whatever it has to do, it will do. But in the CRI side, if I want to kind of leverage the multi-NIC CRI that you're trying to propose, it shouldn't be overriding every other ones. That's what I'm trying to get, because CRI is the only thing in the path between kubelet and CNI, and we cannot have the CRI always thinking, get the name, and based on the name, run that config. It cannot be a just that implementation, because that will just block all the other implementations. You see that? Because if you say if you just do what track A proposes every time, right? That will be the only available implementation then, because nobody else can do anything else. Because if I have foo and bar networks listed, CRI expects there is a foo and bar networks configured in CRI or what's not. So basically, if I use containerd, that is the only thing I can use. I then cannot use Multus at all in the way it is today, of course.
Yeah, you could still use Multus in the proposal.
How would I use, because then I have to create a network called Multus. Let's say we go let's say the CRI implementation will go by a straightforward, just by the name, right? So basically pod networks equals the CNI conf, right? But so then I have to have a pod network called Multus. Inside of it, that will have some additional parameters, but that kind of beats the purpose, because now I have to control CRI additionally on top of my Multus. And that's not the point of the pod network. So I have to have a dual way on how CRI is going to behave. It should behave the way where it just passes along the list, and then, but then to kind of to your cycle, let me share this tab again, to your kind of main point, right? So basically, what would happen is I run the run pod sandbox. I pass down the list of the networks, right? And then you do, and let's say this is the case where I want to support Multus the old way. So what will happen is now CRI sees that, okay, I don't have to do anything about this because the provider is not containerd. So that means the CNI handles this by itself. So basically, I pass the whole list into the CNI. Multus gets a set of parameters into the CNI call, which is expanded by the list of those networks that I want, right? Multus takes that, instead of grabbing it from the pod and grabbing the pod object, now it already has all the names it has to handle in an order, and then it just grabs the pod networks. Then it grabs the pod reference, the parameters reference, and it has the NAD, and then based on that, it will do its own stuff, right? And then what we have to ensure that CNI can return back to the pod sandbox status, right? It can return back the list of the IPs that has been configured. All right, so, and that's up to the CNI to do that, right? So basically, CNI can return you, same as you can pass up the list of networks. Now, a CNI can return back to you a list of IPs that it configured, right? Instead of you retrieving that, right? Because if you retrieve it, that's kind of straightforward because you completely configured it, so you know what's what. But if you didn't configure it, you might not really know what's what. And the CNI has to tell you what's what. You see the difference, Michael?
No, I'm so confused. I'm kind of curious if others got a little tripped up there as well.
I'm trying to catch up too. I mean, and it's not to bust your chops, Mache, because at least the initial thing that you were saying is having this option between whatever, having Multus do this delegation or having whatever containerd and CNI do the delegation. Yes. I like the idea of that, but I'm lost in the struct here a little bit.
So yeah, let me maybe some whiteboarding here.
Some visuals will be helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
Some of the Multus folks are here too.
So can you see me? You can see this, right?
Yeah, I can see the drawing.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we have? We have right now. We will have here. We will have kubelet that is going to send the request, right? We're going to expand it to now send a message to. That's going to be CRI, right? So now this guy sends the message to the CRI here, and then this message will have our new field networks with let's say pod name, right? A pod network name, right? And maybe the provider, as I mentioned, provider. And sorry, this is a struct. So it's not the list. This is a provider. Let me just fix this. So we have, it gives multiple of those, right? Pod network name 1, 2, and provider. Let's say provider is 1, 1, right? So the same provider for those two networks, right? So this is what this is the message I am receiving, and I'm passing to the CRI, right? And now, based on this, let's assume provider is what CRI supports. I have a CRI called provider 1, and then what it happens, what it will do, it will let's assume the implement, and I'm drawing an implementation here. It doesn't really have to be like this because it's up to the CRI how they're gonna implement this, but it will, because CRI controls what the CNI calls are being done, right? So basically it will do the first call to
Is provider being some sort of conditional here? Like if provider 1 do this thing, if provider
yes,
provider 2 equals
that's what
this.
I would assume, because we have to have that. So CNI, and this will be CNI name, sorry, and name equals pod network name 1, right? So we have a CNI called like this, right? And this is a basically CNI conflist, right? CNI dot conflist, and the name is like this, right? And this is understandable, right? What the CNI is, right? And then what I do is, and this is the case where I said that the CRI supports multi-networking, right? Fully. That's why I am trying to make sure that we all understand that CRI is one of the implementers of the network, right? And this is true, right? So CRI does internally support multi-networking fully, nicely, and it will just call conflist pod network 1 and conflist pod network 2. This is what you want to do, right, Michael, today?
Yes, that would work. And I think I'm seeing what you're doing. And I think I want you to elaborate a little bit more on the provider, because I think I'll point out, once you explain it a little bit more, I'm going to point something out, and I think it may derail provider, and I'll let you continue.
Right, so this is the case where this is that, right? But in this world, how do I run Multus in this world? In this case, let's kind of entertain example here, and let's say Multus, right? What do I do here with Multus? Because right now you called a pod network name 1. Basically, this is my MacVLAN interface. How we kind of presented it. This is my maybe not MacVLAN. It's my subnet A, right? How Multus was, how like one of the Tomos example was, where it doesn't have to be what type it is. It's just my pod network name represents subnet A, right? How Multus is going to know it's subnet A, since Multus is based on NADs, NAD on conflists. And I don't think Multus, and Doc, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure you would want to move now to, instead of using NAD objects, just use the conflict files on the node, right? You see that, right, Doc?
Yeah, I mean, but it's without getting into the details, yes, we want to have this user defined
Objects, right?
networks. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like what
So
Multus kind of does, right? To give you this
exactly, this flexibility,
with
right?
the
Exactly.
K8s layer, yeah.
So now, but with this approach, that breaks it, because how do I ensure Multus is being called? Right now, Multus is not being called at all, because what I'm calling is pod network name 1 and the pod network name 2. And if the CRI handles it rightfully. So that completely breaks Multus, because you're gonna A, do 2 calls to the CNI, and B, they are not Multus, right? So that's the problem, right? So this is where what I'm saying, to support something like not only Multus, but other implementers of the multi-networking, we would have to have a case where, let's say, this is provider. Maybe
So
this.
can I point something out really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because if we still want to use Multus,
hmm
then remember what I said earlier about the run pod sandbox request? This object will be nil. And Multus will continue on happily, completely fine with this annotation approach on the pod spec. The only added benefit now is that it can return additional information via the pod sandbox status. So in that case, we don't do anything different. We happily go along the
But we cannot.
path.
No. But how do I define whether this is nil or not? When do I say? What is the condition in kubelet?
So we
to
would
say-
have an annotation on or their pod network field on the pod would be nil. And now we go down the same path. The container runtime in this case, it said, hey, you're nil. I'll go down my normal default path.
No, but then how Multus can use that? We cannot do that. That's the whole point. The API should be usable by everyone, not just by CRI.
Well, it's
That's
still
what-
being used by the CRI. That's how it works today.
So, and I'm trying to tell you that all other implementers for multi-networking wants to use that API, and we cannot just create that API only for the CRIs.
Well, yeah, and we also have to keep in mind now that Multus, if we want to continue using Multus or another backend, Multus may have to make some changes here.
Definitely, that's what we are all here to kind of establish that. But now, in this case, how do I ensure that that we support that, right? So basically what has to happen, this then has to be passed into the CNI. We cannot, because you say, oh, this field will be nil. I cannot, how do I define whether it's nil or not? The pod network field in a pod is not exclusive for the CRI only. Okay, it is used by multiple, can be used by multiple implementations. Okay, so my pod will have this field set same way. So I'm gonna pass those to the CRI, but in this case, CRI should not make this calls, but should make this. Because now I want to support, I want to be backward compatible and I want to support Multus. So what I would imagine, CRI would see, oh, provider is not equals provider X is not equal to me, provider one. So I do nothing with this one. It's not, I'm not handling those pod networks because it's not mine. And then I go to, and I will just pass those guys into the CNI, and we will expand the CNI API to include those guys in the list. And then Multus, as you said, would have to change. Oh, those are the list. That is the list of the networks that I got. So I don't have to go to the pod to get them. CRI at least did that to me. But then the one thing for this is that this guy is going to return back stuff. Sorry about, I'm not sure how to. Is there a way to do a curve connector or something? Yes, there is. So basically this guy now returns back and has, and CRI has to accept this networks, right? And then this guy will return you a pod network name, comma IP or multiple, same like you have, right? So basically, I can return back, CNI can return back you now a list, not of a single IP, but of multiple. And you can just do the same thing what you were doing for your approach, but then you would support this one as well, where, okay, CNI now can return me all the data it gathered, right? Because Multus now run all the CNIs internally, it gathers all the APIs, and now it will, through the CNI call, it will return the list that you would otherwise know about yourself. Right now it's provided by the CNI because now the provider is X, and now the X provider handles the whole thing, but the CRI has to allow us to support this. This is what I'm kind of trying to make sure that we ensure that CRI will not take over the whole field. We cannot allow that, Michael. I would I would say that's kind of beats the whole purpose of our multi-networking discussion here, because we must make sure the pod network field, this guy here, can be used by anyone, right? Where was this? Oh, it was in a pod. So basically,
then provider's in
this
the wrong location then. And this is why, because the CRI is containerd or cryo, which calls the CNI plugins. You want to
Right.
say I think I maybe wrapped what you're saying around my head. You want, and since this is being in the CRI, AK, this is getting passed to the container runtime. You're proposing here that if I want to do this elsewhere, not going through the container runtime, I need to do it. I want to go over here and do it in my controller or something, right? Because in
Yes.
that case, you're passing it something like, is the provider saying, hey, don't do anything and I'm going to handle it elsewhere? Because in
Yes.
that case, you don't want adding the pod network resource stuff may not make a lot of sense. Because that's where I'm getting confused. And I think the diagram you're drawing is a little confusing. So if we add something else needs to tell, hey, I know like something obviously need to say, hey, container runtime, don't do what I'm telling you to do. But right now, the pod networks is the setup and teardown is handled by the container runtimes. However, what you're proposing, say, if we have our default network, that's going to go through the CNI. However, we have A, B, and C networks.
Mhm.
And you want to tell the kubelet or something to say, hey, you're going to set up this. This is your role and responsibility, container runtime. And I have A, B, and C that is going to be done elsewhere. Do not touch this. Is that kind of what you're going at? I'm just
Yes.
trying to like iron the details out.
Yeah. That's exactly because we cannot, because otherwise what you're thinking of doing is completely, you would there will be only one implementation of multi-networking, and that is through the CRIs. And we are on the mercy of containerd or cryo and all the other ones. That's not, and that beats the purpose of what we want to achieve, because it cannot be like just one guy, one implementer just handles the whole thing for us. It
Well,
can,
yeah.
it perfectly can, and that's why we have the provider field. It perfectly can provide that capability. And if someone wants to use the very simple stuff, yes, then they use, oh, I'm using containerd. Containerd expects the provider value to be containerd.io, whatever. And then I set that value, and then I'll just want to your containerd, and my nodes have all the conf lists created for us, and then that's how I want to deal with it, and that's perfectly fine for me, and that's good, right? But there are cases where it shouldn't care about it, right? And like Multus is the one that takes over, and that relies on the conf lists, right? It relies on NAD objects, network attachment definition objects. So that's why we need to allow to be, and even our Google implementation has it has its own objects, some other stuff. So we don't want to rely. CNIs for us is just a stub, basically. We just want you, just make sure you call my agent on the node. That's it. And I will take over and I will do the whole thing. And that's what I want. So basically, CRI is not, I don't want CRI to be one and all implementation. So that's something that we must ensure. And do you see that now?
Well, yeah, I see. Oh, sorry, Doug. He hot mic'd himself. I totally see what you're trying to do. So like, if just allowing provider field passes this, past this, discussion, because like, I don't care if the provider field is there, like that's completely fine. I was just saying that, like, I was trying to figure out the reasoning. I'm not contesting what the providers, I didn't understand what you're doing with that. And like, yeah, so if we can like agree to what the run pod sandbox request would look like, and if that includes like the whatever I put in my status proposal or something shaped like that, that
Right.
works perfectly. However, now I want to like kind of understand the flow Well, one, I really want to iron out the details of what that new message type would look like. But the
Yeah.
second part here is like, can you discuss the flow of the non-CRI approach for multiple networks? Because that's a larger effort in itself. Like the one that we have right in front of us, very simple to do, but I want to understand the details of the non-CRI approach, because there's I put in the proposal, there's like a future work, like a new
Mhm.
API and more. I'm trying to figure out that piece. That would be helpful.
So what do you mean define non-CRI approach? Because this is what I'm confused. The multi-networking not done by CRI?
Yeah, well, in the current diagrams, that's the iterative approach. And so let's just talk about, say, we have pod. Well, here's the scenario. We have we have our default network, obviously. We'll just call it
Mhm.
Calico for funsies.
Mhm.
And then we have pod network name 1 and name 2. We have provider X and provider Y. Can you shed some details on that? That's, I think, will help clarify your thought process for us.
So we have,
Would it be
what do we
would
have?
it be
We,
possible to kind of separate the interfaces and the kind of implementations? I think CRI is just the interface, and then there's the container runtime,
Right.
and then there's CNI and the kind of CNI plugin or agent or whatever implementation it is.
right.
At least it would help me to understand the call flow better.
So basically you said default provider Calico, that's the default network, right? And then we have some NetB and then provider. And do we want to make provider here? So that's the thing, because now I can have provider, let's say CRI, right? And I can do this. I can have, let's say, let A, and then I can have NetB provider Multus, right? For funsies. So
When you
I
say
completely, yeah, go ahead.
the bit that's confusing me, and maybe other people have been finding the same, is I was assuming that the provider would be CNI. That means call the CNI with some parameters. I think what you're saying is it's a much more granular thing than that, that there has to be some configuration somewhere that understands that the provider for Calico is called CNI with a bunch of, or whatever you're using, with a bunch of parameters for Calico and a bunch of configuration for that Calico.
Yeah, and that's what it is.
Right.
That's what, so basically those provider names will be specified by the specific providers. And the thing here is we need to, what I'm trying to say containerd cry.io is one of the providers. That's what we are I'm trying to call out. It's not just a standardized piece. It's not part of kubelet. No, it's one of the providers because it's in the path and it can take over the whole thing. That's why it cannot be just a transparent thingy that I think currently the plan is up what the top picture would show, right? CRI would
Right.
implement some ways of it, right? And then it will completely take over, right? Because then I cannot do, for example, Multus.
So the current networking model is that the kubelet calls CRI, and CRI
Yes.
then calls the networking implementation.
Yes, the CNI.
Are you proposing that? Yeah. So CRI, whatever, but normally CNI.
Yeah.
And I think what you're proposing is that the kubelet would only sometimes call the CRI with network information. Sometimes it would call something else. Do they all
No.
go through the CRI or not? I'm not
They
sure.
always go. No,
They
they always go through the CRI. I don't want to change that path, right? So basically, what to what Michael was trying to ask for, right? Top case is where CRI is handling the multi-networking, and I'm just proposing here one of the ways it could be implemented. I don't say it has to be like this, but this is one of the ways it could be implemented, and it's up to the CRI how they would do that, right? But then the bottom picture is basically the default that we have today. kubelet passes calls CRI. CRI just basically calls the first CNI conf list, right? That's what is being happening today. And basically, I want some of the implementers like Multus relies on that implementation. Maybe in the future, Multus would integrate in some ways with the top approach. in some ways, but that I don't know whether that's even possible, but maybe they can, right? Then they don't have to rely on this. But we must ensure that we can support that approach where the today's implementers are reliant on the case that back in the days you were calling only just one CNI, and that was always the first in the alphanumerical order. And like today, most
So-
of the things can rely on this, right?
Mache, so in this middle one that you've got with the distinct providers, Calico, CRI, Multis,
Mhm.
in that particular case, it'd be drawn with the kubelet box and then 3 arrows from there.
Yes. So
Okay.
no, so basically I would see
No.
this. So I would have in this case, right? And let's say provider CRI, let me just kind of make this. So that, and then let me just we have such message, right? We have so default provider, and what I would see in this case, and it will be a bit of a messy, but this could be supported as well, right? So I would have my default is called by provider Calico and the others. So how would I see is this would get that, right? And of course, that's up to how CRI would handle that and the ordering and all that. That will have to happen. That's one, right? I don't have space here. Sorry, let me just maybe this. And then slightly this up here, and then so that's obvious, right? That's a let's say default. Then the other one is net B, right? And then here I would call name, what is the name? Net B, right? No, net A. Because now one of the providers is me, right? And this is a complete mix of the whole thing, but it is possible. And basically why not, right? Where I put one of the networks it is provided by the CRI. So basically all the other networks that I don't own, I just do the default stuff as I did today, right? It's a bit of a mess because then I provide those networks to the first CNI conf list, and maybe it's Multus or something else, right? And then it handles the whole thing. But then I have one of the networks is a provider CRI, right? So that will make another CNI call on the other hand that will call the net A stuff. And I'm not sure whether that then opens that possibility, right? With what I'm thinking CRI should do, right? And this is a
it's Wim here. Quick question. I put it in the chat, but in this case, does the CRI not need to understand the expected behavior of the provider? Because in one case it just calls one conf list, in the other case it has to split it.
It has to, because it has to match to its own provider, right? Because that's so.
Yes.
That's what I'm getting at, right? So because and what I'm trying to tell as well, like Containerd versus CRI-IO, they both can implement their multi-networking in completely different ways. I don't know what that can be, but that might be the case, right? Why we are forcing them to standardize on how they're gonna do the networking. This approach on the top, right? It might be just.
No, I get that. My point is, how does the CRI know what he has to do?
So CRI, based on
provider.
that's why I'm thinking to pass in the provider, because I was otherwise CRI doesn't have. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, CRI doesn't have API access, right? It cannot just pull the objects, right?
No, it doesn't have that ability unless
Right.
we wanted it to.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I don't think we would want to for this, right? So basically, what do we do? So we have to pass all the data we could to the CRI so it knows what to do next, right? So in this case, I was thinking, okay, let's pass that provider as well to the CRI so that it then can determine based on the provider what to do. Do I handle that network or not? You see that?
And
Wim?
my point is more, yeah, I get that. My point is more the registration of this provider and the behavior expected by the CRI with respect to them. How do you get that at startup time? How does the CRI get that?
Say again. So, can you? I don't think I
Yeah, today
understand.
we have a single conf list, right? So we call the first one in the list, and I
Right.
think the behavior here will change depending on what how the provider behaves. So my question is, how does the CRI know how to react based on the provider name?
So that will be based on how the containerd implements it, or CRI-O. That's up to them. That's what I'm trying to tell and say. That's
So
they should
does
have
that mean that does mean though that we're putting a requirement on things like Containerd that they must be able to recognize the full list of providers that will be used in this deployment and know what to do in every case? You know, maybe that's a
But-
config file or something like that. So that might
but
be,
but
for example,
that's Pete. That will be the part of their support for multi-network, won't it?
Well, in the current state, if we temporary pull out provider, we pass in the network names, interface name, and
Yeah, all the other
that
parameters.
supports
Mhm,
as
mhm.
is, and we move the effort forward from a CRI perspective. We probably need to decouple provider and say the workflow, because right now we're adding provider, and if we're going to go super iterative, I want to know like what we're doing with that, because in this pod networks default net A, net B, effectively the provider is CNI. We shouldn't be calling out the specific implementation like Calico and more. That's where I think a few people are also getting wrapped up, is like, tell me the path where we don't use the CRI here.
When the provider is not equals provider, right? CRI then is just a pass through, and then
Yeah.
I don't have. Then those guys below, those two guys don't exist, right? And basically, then then basically what happens is I have only this. I had the default behavior. So the provider is completely different. CRI is just a pass through, and you do nothing. Because how do I, Michael? Tell me. So you need to support. Let's say you need to support Multus as it is today. If you are going to say, yeah.
Maciek, if I think what you're basically saying is there is a few registered providers like Multus and maybe CRI, right? That has a default, that has a behavior that is known. Everything else just pass to something. I think that's what you're,
exactly. So basically,
CRIs,
CRIs create their own names, specific hard-coded provider CRI names. Exactly what you said. I mean, yes. And basically,
so does that mean Containerd is going to have hard-coded into it?
Yes.
Understanding of Calico.
Yes.
Say.
Yes. No.
I don't think Calico, not necessarily. I think
care about
my understanding is there is two registered.
Right? So
let's call it. I think I think the way I would phrase it is the current CNI and maybe Multus, right? So those are the two, and maybe there is a third. But
no,
and then everything else is or.
No, folks. CRI only knows about its own provider, doesn't care about the other ones. So basically, CRI is Containerd, so I care only about Containerd, and I do my stuff only for Containerd. I don't care about the other ones. Anything that is something, a provider that is not called Containerd, I just do the default piece. You see that? So basically, if I have here on the provider, that's why that field is explicitly stating that what the key of a provider do I support based on the CRI, and let's say this is Containerd, and basically the provider key that I hard coded into my implementation is Containerd. I don't care about what are the other ones, whether it's Calico, Multus. For those, I just do the default stuff. If it's not Containerd, I do this. If it's Containerd, then I do this additional call, or however the CRI wants to supporting it. All right, so that's what I was calling up here, right? Provider, it's called provider here. And when the networks that are passed to me are called provider, okay, I will do, it means someone wants me to handle those networks. So I will do that. I just want to ensure we do this. Otherwise, if we don't have the provider, CRI is the only way to do it.
Well,
I'm not
so
sure you see that, right? I don't
no.
want CRI being the only one and the only way to do it. That's not something that we can have.
And Mache, I understand your concern. What I mentioned earlier too is that if you're passing it via the CRI, the container runtime is going to receive this.
Mhm.
And where you're putting provider effectively says you're going to the container runtime and you're going to go do something. So what I mentioned earlier is that this field is in the wrong location. That's all I'm saying, that the kubelet either is going to the container runtime or it's going somewhere else. That's
But
what you just said, because you can't be telling the container runtime, hey, here's all this stuff, because it's already at the container runtime, but you're saying it, and I understand you're trying to say it's not the runtime here, and I'm just saying this decision logic is in the wrong place.
but
here.
then Michael, then we move away from CRI, which I think nobody's gonna agree to.
Well,
Because
that's the whole container runtime. So the only alternative, if you want to propose moving away from the CRI for the network setup, if you go down, scroll to my document, there's a place where you can do just what you said. And that field, once again, provider, is still in the wrong location if it's in the run pod sandbox. So if you want to say like, we have provider CRI, container D, cryo, and now you have provider Mache's implementation. So right now, the roles and responsibilities of run pod sandbox is, in the current state, is create the network namespace, set up the network. Now, if you want to have a provider come in here, it's right where your cursor is. Run pod sandbox and between create containers. So at that point, you can actually have an entire new API right between there.
But then Michael, then I'm gonna bring up what Pete and Wim just left, what Pete and Wim brought up. Now kubelet would have to hard code all the known CRI's provider names. Then you ask kubelet to include, this is a container D provider, or this is this guy. So now I have to implement what CRIs there are inside kubelet and hard code those values there. So that won't fly either, because then because I have to decide whether I leave that list empty or not in kubelet. And to do that, I have to know what is the CRI, and then compare that CRI's provider with whatever is in the pod name. So that's then you hard code only and support only specific list of CRIs, which we cannot have. It has to be standardized. So that's why you see that.
But we already do that. Like we already saying that this
are?
node is using container D or not.
Okay.
So that's where I think why don't we just take a tactical pause? Oh, we're over time. I think we need to. I think what would be helpful is giving you maybe a run through of what the current flow is of like, what is run pod sandbox actually doing?
Yeah, I need to dig into this myself.
And I have literally it all in like links that I can share and walk you through, because I understand what you're trying to do. And I think where I'm pushing back is that we already have the CRI. We're not going to go and you can't do it outside the CRI. You have to do it elsewhere. And that's where I was saying earlier, is like we have an iterative approach here. And what I want to say is that we take this iterative approach and say, hey, this works for 90% and is not working for the other 10%. And that reveals the need for what you're stating actually in like the true like Scrum iterative fashion. So I like the proposal that I think you're trying to get to is what I mentioned in the future state, that we're going to come to the conclusion that the CRI API doesn't work for a lot of our use cases. And that's where we need to go. And that's where we probably should look at the current behavior from kubelet all the way to the container runtime, exactly what it's doing, and then identify like, hey, how could we move this effort forward in an iterative way, but also say like, hey, future work bullet point number 4 in the parentheses is that, we're going to start saying that this just simply no longer works for networking. And Cisco, Juniper, and Arista all have come to this conclusion. But we also have to like build the case so we can move the bar forward. And then we can also talk about what you're proposing, because it'll reveal itself when we start implementing it and using it, that it works for 90%. And then for our, our P9999 cases, we can't do this.
Right. All right, folks, let's reconvene next week. I think we are way over time. Right. Thanks, everyone.
Definitely. Have a
Alright,
good one.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. All right, take it easy.